The fire screen arrived at Lady Cavendish's house in Grosvenor Square on the morning of the 11th of November, wrapped in linen and carried by Phoebe herself through the servants' entrance and up 2 flights of back stairs to the blue drawing room, where the season's first gathering of consequence had already begun assembling by the time she was permitted to unwrap it. She had not been invited. She had been summoned, which was a different thing, entirely, and she stood with her back to the wall while the footman carried the frame to its appointed position near the window, and the assembled ladies drifted toward it with the particular floating motion of women who have been told to admire something and intend to do so briefly. Phoebe pressed her hands flat against her skirts. The embroidery had taken her 6 weeks. The design had been supplied to her in advance, a foliate pattern, intricate and strange, dense with tiny lettering that the client's agent had assured her was decorative script in the classical fashion, signifying nothing, charming everything. She had reproduced it faithfully, stitch by stitch in silk thread of 4 colors, working by candlelight when the shop's natural light failed. She was proud of it. She had not permitted herself to say so. He came through the connecting door from the library at 11:15, and the room rearranged itself around him the way rooms do for men of a certain station and a certain coldness. He was tall and dark-coated, his cravat perfectly white, his jaw set with the particular discipline of a man who has trained himself not to betray what he notices. He noticed the fire screen. He stopped. He looked at it for a long time, longer than politeness required, and then he turned to Lord Cavendish beside him and said, quietly enough that he perhaps did not intend it to carry, the seamstress's crooked stitches. Good Lord, Charles would have laughed. It carried to Phoebe. The room heard it. Miss Helena Farrow, positioned at the Viscount's elbow in a gown the color of winter ice, permitted herself a small smile. The ladies near the screen stepped back slightly, as if reassessing. Phoebe did not move. She had learned in the 2 years since her father's death that stillness was the only dignity available to her in rooms like this one, and she kept it now, though something tightened in her throat that she refused to identify as hurt. She had not come to be seen. She had come to deliver work and depart. She made herself look at the embroidery one last time, at the careful lines of her own hand rendered in gold and green and ivory, and then she walked back the way she had come. She did not know his name until she reached the street. One of the kitchen girls followed her out, wanting to know whether the modiste would accept a commission from Lady Cavendish's sister, and in the course of the conversation mentioned that the tall gentleman by the door was Viscount Hartfield, of the Foreign Office, and that he was expected to make an offer to Miss Farrow by Christmas. Phoebe walked the 3/4 of a mile back to Madame Roper's establishment on Bond Street, and said nothing to anyone about any of it. The shop was narrow and warm and smelled of dye and pressed linen, and Phoebe had lived in the 2 rooms above it since the autumn of the year her father's creditors had finished with what remained of the Marsh estate. That word estate was generous. It had been a small property in Wiltshire, modest even in its prosperous years, a house with 3 servants and a roof that let in the November rain, and a library whose books were sold before the furniture. Her father had died apologizing. She had held his hand and told him there was nothing to forgive, and she had believed it, even knowing what the loss of the house would require of her. What it had required was her needle, which had always been fine, and her eyes, which were sharp, and her capacity to work from 6 in the morning until the candles guttered, and to find in it a discipline that was not quite happiness, but was close enough to sustain Mrs. Beatty. Roper was a stout, kind woman of 50 who had taken Phoebe on not from pity, but from recognition, having been a seamstress's daughter herself before 2 successive husbands had elevated and then left her, and she did not require Phoebe to be grateful, which meant Phoebe could be genuinely fond of her instead. There was an apprentice named Nell, 14, who had a gift for pleading and a habit of crying when she ran out of thread, and 2 other women who came in by the day when large commissions required it. The shop made a respectable living. Phoebe's wages were modest, and her rooms were cold in January, and she owned 5 dresses, one of which was suitable for delivering work to houses in Grosvenor Square. She kept her father's ivory needle case at the bottom of her sewing basket, wrapped in chamois leather. He had given it to her mother as a courting gift, long before Phoebe was born, carved by a craftsman in Bath, with a small stylized flower on the lid. And when her mother died, it had passed without ceremony into the sewing basket, and when her father died, Phoebe had not thought to put it on the creditor's table. It was small, and not worth much. She was not a sentimental woman, or she told herself so. And yet she could not begin a new commission without opening the basket, touching the leather, setting it aside with a kind of deliberateness that had no name she was willing to give it. She had opened the basket the morning the commission arrived. The gentleman's agent had come 2 months before the delivery, a quiet man, well-dressed, who had presented a design on a roll of paper and a fee in advance that was twice what they would normally charge, and who had asked, with particular emphasis, that the design be reproduced exactly. Not interpreted, not improved upon, exactly as drawn. She had agreed. Clients who paid double and asked for exactness were not unusual in the trade. She did not ask other questions about matters that were not her concern. If she thought the lettered pattern strange, denser than was fashionable, the script itself tilted in a way that resisted reading, she had set the thought aside in the discipline of the work itself, the counting of stitches, the careful matching of color, the slow building of image from thread and patience and candlelight. She was good at setting thoughts aside. It was her most reliable skill. She had thought of it again in the small room above the shop on the evening after delivering the fire screen, the Viscount's voice quiet and certain, the seamstress's crooked stitches. She had thought of the design she had been given, the word exactly repeated by the agent, with a kind of pressure she had not examined at the time. She set the thought aside and went to sleep. They came to the shop 2 mornings later. There were 2 of them, a young man with an official air and a nervous manner, and an older man in a dark coat who introduced himself as Mr. Spid, Josiah Trent, and said he was there on behalf of His Majesty's government on a matter of some delicacy. And would Mrs. Roper be so good as to allow him a few minutes with Miss Marsh? Mrs. Marsh. Roper was not particularly good with being so, but she had a sound instinct for when resistance would make things worse. She showed them into the back room, brought Phoebe in from the cutting table, and withdrew. Though not so far, she could not hear through the half-open door, which Phoebe noticed and was grateful for. "The matter, Mr. Rebist," Trent explained, concerned the fire screen delivered to Lady Cavendish's house. Specifically, the embroidered design on it. It had come to the attention of certain parties that the design contained a coded communication, a cipher whose significance to national interests was considerable. The question before him was the simple question of where the design had originated. Phoebe told him without hesitation that the design had been brought to the shop by a gentleman's agent 2 months since, and that she had reproduced it as instructed, and that she had retained the original as a professional record, which was her invariable practice with supplied designs, and that she would produce it on request. Mr. Trent's expression shifted in a way that suggested he had been prepared for a more difficult conversation. He asked to see the original. She retrieved it from the upper shelf of the workroom, still rolled and tied with its original ribbon, and laid it on the cutting table. He studied it in silence for a long moment, and then he said that a Viscount Hartfield would wish to speak with her directly, and that she should be prepared to attend at the Foreign Office the following morning at 9 o'clock. She felt the name land in her chest, the way cold water lands. He was already in the room when they brought her through the door at 5 minutes to 9. He stood at the window with his back to her, and he did not turn immediately, which she suspected was deliberate. A technique for making the person entering the room feel the weight of the space before he chose to acknowledge them. She refused to feel it. She took the chair offered to her and folded her hands in her lap, and looked at the back of his coat and waited. When he turned, his face was contained. If he recognized her, the woman from Lady Cavendish's drawing room, the invisible one near the wall, he gave nothing. He looked at her, the way he had looked at the fire screen, carefully and without expression. She noticed that his eyes were gray, the color of a November sky above the Thames, and that there was something in them that was not coldness exactly, but was its near relation. The look of a man who has learned to keep what he feels behind a wall of will. "Miss Marsh," he said, You sewed the fire screen. I did, my lord. The design was brought to your establishment by an agent. Yes. You do not know the name of the principal he represented. He did not offer it. I did not ask. That is common practice. He moved from the window to the table and looked at the rolled original that Trent had placed there, already unrolled and weighted at the corners with small brass weights. He studied it, without touching it. She watched his face, and saw the moment when something in it changed, a slight compression around the eyes, a stillness that was different from his prior stillness, more concentrated. Whatever he saw there, it meant something to him beyond the cipher. The stitches in the central panel, he said. You deviated from the original in 3 places. She had not known that she would be required to defend her work a second time in as many days. But she felt the steadiness come up in her the way it always did when someone misread what she had made. I did not deviate. The 3 places you are indicating are corrections. The original design contained errors of proportion that would have made the finished piece distorted. I corrected the proportion. The character of every element is identical to the original. I can demonstrate this if you will give me a moment with the original and the piece together. He looked at her. A long look, the kind that is trying to determine whether what it is seeing is what it appears to be. She met it without flinching. She had been looked at by creditors. This was not worse. You are telling me, he said slowly, that the deviations were yours. They were corrections. Trained corrections. Yes. Something moved through his face that was almost acknowledgement. He said, "Thank you, Miss Marsh," and looked back at the design, and she understood she had been dismissed. She stood. She gathered her gloves. She was nearly at the door when he said, without looking up, "Do not leave the city." She stopped, heard it as threat, registered it as threat, felt the whole weight of her situation press down on her at once. Suspect, seamstress, alone, in a room with a man who had already demonstrated he could define her in 3 words in front of a drawing room full of people. She turned. He had still not looked up from the design. She left without answering. She did not tell Mrs. Roper everything. She told her enough that Mrs. Brax. Roper said with a flatness that was her version of alarm, "Stay close and say nothing without a witness." And that was sufficient. What Phoebe did not tell Mrs. Moore Roper was that she had come home from the Foreign Office with a peculiar clarity working in her chest that she could not account for. It was not reassurance. He had given her nothing that resembled reassurance. It was something stranger, the sense that the gray eyes had been reading her the way she read a piece of work, looking for the difference between an error and a correction, and that they had not yet concluded she was the former. He came to the shop 3 days later. He did not announce himself. He arrived at 4:15 in the afternoon, when the light in the cutting room was still good, and he came through the front, which meant Mrs. Roper had to decide in the span of 3 seconds whether to show him to the back or the upstairs sitting room. And she chose the back, because she was a woman who understood that men of his manner came to see the work, not the furniture. Phoebe was at her embroidery frame. She was not working on anything with political consequence, a set of chair cushion covers for a vicar's household, stolid and unambiguous in crimson and cream, and she did not look up when she heard the door because she had learned to finish a sequence of stitches before interrupting her count. She finished the sequence. She looked up. He was standing near the door, his hat in his hand, watching her. Not with the contained analytical look from the Foreign Office. With something quieter. She thought, without meaning to, of the way she read designs before she began them. A kind of patient attention that was also a kind of respect for the work's own logic. "My lord," she said, "I apologize for coming without notice." She waited. "I wanted to observe," he said, "without the structure of an official inquiry." "Then you are welcome to observe." He did not sit. He moved to the window where the light fell across her frame, and looked at the work in progress with the same quality of attention he had given the fire screen design, but without whatever had complicated it. He watched her work for perhaps 10 minutes. She let him. keeping her count, keeping her rhythm, not performing for him and not ignoring him. Nell came in once with thread and went out again with the particular subtlety of a 14-year-old who has been told to be subtle, which is to say, not subtly at all. "My brother Charles," he said at last, without preface or softening, "was hanged 4 years ago for treason. She kept her needle moving." This was the kind of sentence that required not reacting to immediately if you wished the speaker to continue. The evidence against him was documentary, a letter in his hand and a code the government's men deciphered. He had sent it to a contact in Paris. He paused. He had not. The letter was a forgery. I have been 3 years arriving at that conclusion, and I am not yet in a position to prove it in a room that will matter. "The same cipher," Phoebe said quietly. "The same network." His voice was flat, not raw. "The design brought to your shop was produced by that network. You were not the intended author. You were the instrument." She set down her needle. She looked at her hands, at the needle marks in her fingertips, at the evidence of 6 weeks in the silk and gold thread of someone else's message. "And the correction I made," she said. "The 3 places they disrupted the sequence. The cipher does not read cleanly in the finished piece. The man who was to receive it, the fire screen was intended to be sold on to a specific buyer, would not have been able to decode it. You broke the communication. You did not know you were doing so." She felt something cold move through her, and then something almost like amusement, a dark and private thing that had no place to land. 6 weeks of careful work and what she had preserved in it was nothing more than the correct proportions of a foliate pattern. And what that preservation had done, without her knowledge, was prevent a treasonous message from reaching a French agent. "They will try to place the blame on me," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he looked directly. At her then, the November sky, eyes direct and unguarded in a way they had not been at the Foreign Office. Specifically, Sir Gerald Ashby, whose agent commissioned the work, will attempt to demonstrate that you designed the pattern yourself, that you are a knowing participant. He has the means to manufacture supporting evidence. He has done it before. She heard, beneath the information, what he was not saying. He was not saying he would protect her. He was not saying she was safe. He was saying she was standing on the edge of something, and he was telling her so, because he believed she had the right to know it. "What do I do?" she said. "Keep the original design where it is safe. Tell no one where it is." "And," he added, as if the words cost him something he had intended to keep, "do not, under any circumstance, let anyone convince you to leave the city." He put his hat on and left. She sat at the frame for a long time, after the needle still in her hand, looking at the chair cushion work with its stolid crimson and cream, its uncoated domesticity. She thought about Charles Vane, who had been hanged for a forgery. She thought about her father, who had died apologizing for numbers that did not balance. She thought about the ivory needle case at the bottom of her basket, and the woman who had carried it before her, and the ordinary human instinct to be remembered by the work of one's hands. She thought about the quality of his attention when he watched her work, the patience of it, the absence in it of judgment. She thought this, then thought about the words, "the seamstress's crooked stitches," and the 2 images of the same man would not resolve into one. He had believed it, at first, that her work was flawed. He did not believe it now. She did not know what to do with that. She could feel in the small room the specific temperature of a space he had recently occupied. The quality of the air was different. She resented that it was mildly, the way she resented rain when she had planned to walk. Sir Gerald Ashby made his move on a Thursday. It came as an invitation, which was not an invitation, to attend at the home of Lady Constance Vane, the Viscount Hartfield's mother, who resided in a house on Upper Brook Street, and who was, as Phoebe learned from Mrs. Trade, Roper, a woman of formidable social authority who had spent 4 years compressing her grief over Charles into a project of protecting the family name from any further damage. She went because refusing would have been taken as evidence of something. The house on Upper Brook Street was cold in its particular way. Clean? Correct. The kind of cold that is produced not by inadequate fires, but by the careful removal of any warmth that does not serve a social function. Lady Constance received her in the drawing-room, seated, with Miss Helena Farrow, arranged beside her in a gown of pale lavender, and Sir Gerald standing near the window, in the posture of a man whose presence in such a gathering requires no explanation. Phoebe had seen Lady Constance at a distance at 2 social events and up close for the first time now. She was a handsome woman of 60, with a particular kind of beauty that does not soften with age but resharpens, and she looked at Phoebe the way a woman looks at something she has decided is beneath examination, but is willing to examine briefly in the service of efficiency. "The creature who sewed those crooked stitches," she said. To no one in particular, in the tone of a woman reading from a document. "I confess I had expected someone more conspicuous." Phoebe clasped her hands. Sir Gerald moved from the window. He was a broad man, gray at the temples, with the smooth manner of someone who has spent decades in the practice of appearing agreeable while being the opposite. He smiled at Phoebe with great warmth. "Miss Marsh, we are grateful you came. This is a simple matter, and I am sure we can resolve it directly." What he meant by directly was alone, without Mr. Prodder. Trent present, without Edmund Vane present, in a room where the only other person was his niece and the Dowager Viscountess, both of whom would testify to whatever he required them to testify to. He had a document. He laid it on the side table with the confidence of a man who has laid documents on side tables before and watched them do their work. It purported to be a letter from Phoebe to a known agent of the French government. It was in a hand that was close enough to hers to require expert examination to distinguish. She looked at the document. She did not touch it. She looked at the hand and thought, "Close, but the loop of the lowercase e is wrong. I make mine open. This is closed." She had been looking at letters and their formation for 20 years. She was not mistaken. "You are asking me to sign a statement," she said. "We are asking you," Sir Gerald said, "to confirm certain facts that will allow this matter to resolve without your further involvement. You are a seamstress. You have no stake in the larger question. Sign the statement, and this is finished for you. What is in the statement?" He told her. The statement would confirm that the design for the fire screen had been her own, that she had designed the cipher independently, and that she had acted under instruction from a foreign principal she had never met in person, and whose identity she did not know. It would shift the origin of the cipher to her. It would close the investigation. It would, he did not quite say, prevent him from proceeding with the forged letter. Phoebe stood in the cold drawing-room and thought about Charles Vane. "No," she said. Lady Constance's fan stilled for exactly 1 second, then resumed its motion. Sir Gerald's smile remained, but lost its warmth, so precisely that it was difficult to say whether it had ever been warm. Miss Farrell looked at the wall. "Miss Marsh," Sir Gerald said, "you should understand the alternative." "I understand it," Phoebe said. "I am declining it." She left before he could say anything further. She could feel Lady Constance's gaze on her back across the full width of the room and all the way to the door, and it was a gaze she recognized, the gaze of a woman who has decided that you do not exist in any register that can oppose her, and who will discover only later that she was wrong about that. She went back to Bond Street, and she did the thing she should have done 3 days earlier, when the intelligence first arranged itself clearly in her mind, and she went to the shelf, retrieved the rolled original design, carried it downstairs, and locked it in the cash box that Mrs. Binting Roper kept under the counter. 3 days later, Mr. Trent came to the shop again. He came alone, without the young official, and his manner had changed. He was sorry, he said, to inform her that a complaint had been filed with the magistrate's court, that she was to appear before a hearing in 2 days' time, that the evidence in the complaint included a letter in what was claimed to be her hand. She said she understood, and asked whether Viscount Hartfield had been informed. Mr. Ridd. Trent said, in the careful voice of a man keeping something from its proper shape, that Viscount Hartfield had been removed from the investigation by Sir Gerald on grounds of a potential impropriety in his methods, and that he was not currently in a position to act in an official capacity. Phoebe sat with this for a long moment. Outside, November rain moved against the shop window. Nell was upstairs crying about something. Mrs. Roper appeared in the doorway, read the scene, and said nothing. "The original design," Phoebe said. "Is it evidence?" "It would be. If it could be authenticated." "It can be authenticated. I know a draper on St. Martin's Lane who supplied the particular ink in which it was drawn. He supplied it to one customer in the last 2 years. That customer was not me." Trent looked at her with the expression of a man revising his understanding of a situation. He did not say the thing he was thinking. He said, instead, "I will need that design, and I will need you to show me to the draper before the hearing." She unlocked the cash box. The night before the hearing, she sat at her frame and did not work. She held the needle case in both hands, the ivory warm from her skin, the small carved flower under her thumb. She thought about what her father used to say about thread, that the weakness of a single strand was not a flaw in the material, but a feature of it, because a single strand, under enough pressure, would simply slip free rather than tear. And it was the weaving together of strands that produced what could hold weight. She was one strand. She had been asked by a man, and a system that expected her to be easy to break, to slip free of the design they had drawn her into. She had not. She could not explain entirely why not. Partly it was her father's voice. Partly it was Charles Vane, who had not had the chance to refuse. Partly it was the Viscount standing in her workroom watching her hands with that quality of attention that had nothing in it of contempt. She went to sleep with the needle case on the table beside her. The hearing was held at the magistrate's at 10 o'clock, and Sir Gerald arrived at Lady Cavendish's salon in Grosvenor Square at 20 minutes past 11. He did not know that Phoebe had already been there for an hour. He did not know that Mr. Trent had attended the hearing with the original design and the draper from St. Martin's Lane, who confirmed under examination that the ink had been supplied to a single account in the preceding year. That account registered to a name that was not Phoebe's. He did not know that the complaint had been withdrawn by noon, or that Phoebe had been directed here at the Viscount Hartfield's request, via a note that said only, "Lady Cavendish's, 11 o'clock." She was standing near the window when Sir Gerald entered. The room was much as it had been 2 weeks ago. The same gathered ladies, the same season's opening quality of light. The fire screen, still in its position by the wall. She noted that several of those present had been at the Upper Brook Street house, including Miss Farrow, who was at the far side of the room with her hand on the arm of an elderly relation, and who had been watching Phoebe since she arrived with the alert expression of someone who is trying to read a text whose language she does not recognize. Lady Constance was there. She was seated, as she had been at Upper Brook Street, in the contained posture of a woman who believes that rooms orient themselves around her, which in most rooms they did. Barash. She had seen Phoebe arrive, and had not acknowledged it, which was acknowledgment of a particular and pointed kind. Sir Gerald moved to Lord Cavendish with his easy warmth, exchanged a word or two, began to settle himself into the geography of the room. He had the bearing of a man who has won. Phoebe watched him, and felt something cold and precise where fear had been. Edmund arrived at 11:30. He came through the connecting door from the library, as he had before, and the room rearranged itself, as it had before. He was followed by Mr. Trent and by a second man she did not recognize. A senior official of some kind, gray-haired, with the specific bearing of a man who carries legal authority in his person rather than his papers. The room read this entrance correctly, and went quiet. Edmund did not look at Phoebe. He looked at Sir Gerald. Sir Gerald turned. "Still easy, still warm," he said. "Hartfield, I had not expected you here. I was given to understand you had been removed from the investigation." "Trent has reinstated me," Edmund said, "on grounds that the grounds for my removal were supplied by the principal party in an active criminal matter." The room understood this in stages. Phoebe watched it move across the assembled faces, the recalibration, the particular social animal instinct for sensing which way a scene is turning. Lady Constance's fan had not moved since Edmund entered. Sir Gerald said, with a smile that was working harder than it looked, "This is not the appropriate venue." "You conducted your interview with Miss Marsh in a private venue," Edmund said. "You filed your complaint in a magistrate's court. I am returning the matter to the room where it began." He crossed to the fire screen. He stopped beside it. "The design for this piece was commissioned by your agent, Sir Gerald, from Madame Roper's establishment on Bond Street, using a pattern produced by your network. The draper who supplied the ink for that pattern confirmed this morning, under examination, that it was sold to an account registered in your name. The pattern contains a cipher communicating intelligence to a French contact. That contact was the intended recipient of this screen before its sale was disrupted." Sir Gerald said, "This is a fabrication. The seamstress herself is the source of the cipher. I have a letter in her hand." "You have a forgery in her hand," Edmund said. "In the same hand that produced the forgery in my brother's hand 4 years ago. The same craftsman. Mr. Trent has the comparison before the senior magistrate now." The room had gone very still. Not the polished stillness of Lady Cavendish's gatherings, but a different stillness. The kind produced by the sudden awareness that what has been witnessed cannot be unwitnessed. Lady Constance made a small sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of something structural shifting. Sir Gerald's voice lost its warmth with the speed of a candle snuffed between 2 fingers. "You have nothing that will stand in a court. I have the original design. I have the draper's testimony. I have the deciphered communication. I have 3 witnesses to your conversation with Miss Marsh at Upper Brook Street." Edmund's voice was level, unhurried, carrying the quiet of a man who has waited 3 years for this room and does not intend to waste it on volume. He turned from the fire screen. He looked at Sir Gerald directly. The stitches were hers. The treason was yours. The room breathed. Sir Gerald did not answer. He would answer in other rooms before other authorities with consequences that were now beyond the saving reach of social grace or official removal. He did not answer here. He put down his glass. He walked to the door with the controlled bearing of a man who understands he has lost, and there were 2 men in the corridor who would ensure he did not proceed further than the front hall. Phoebe stood near the window and felt her hands for the first time in 2 weeks unclench. She was not watching Edmund when he moved. She was watching the fire screen, the gold and green and ivory of her own careful work. The foliate pattern that looked to the untrained eye like the ordinary decorative language of the period. The 3 corrections she had made not out of anything like heroism, but out of the particular stubbornness of a woman who has been doing this for 15 years and cannot reproduce an error with a straight conscience. Then she heard his step, and he was beside her. He did not speak immediately. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the fire screen with her, and she was aware of the specific quality of the air when he was close, warmer than the room, slightly, and carrying the scent of cold stone and wool and something underneath that was simply him, particular and unmistakable. She was aware of her own pulse. She was aware that she did not look away from the embroidery, and that he did not look away from it either, and that this shared looking was doing something she did not have clear language for. "Miss Marsh," he said, "my lord, I owe you an apology." She considered this. "You owe me too." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very carefully, he said, "I do." She turned to look at him. Up close, the November sky eyes had something new in them, or something newly visible. Not exactly warmth, but the condition that exists just before warmth, the state of a frost that is thinking about relenting. He met her look and did not glance away, and she thought again of that quality of attention in her workroom, the patience in it, the recognition. "The corrections you made," he said, "they are what broke the cipher." "They are what made the piece correct," she said. "That was all I intended." "I know." He paused. "I know what you intended. I watched you work." And she felt that land in her chest specific and small. the weight of being observed by someone who was trying to understand rather than to judge. "You told me not to leave the city," she said. "I did." I understood it as a threat. "It was not a threat. I understand that now." She let the acknowledgement settle. "You were also the man who said, in Lady Cavendish's drawing room in my hearing, and the hearing of the assembled company, that my work was inferior," he said. "I know. I was wrong about the work, and I was wrong to say it where you could hear it, and I was most wrong to say it where you could not answer me." He looked at the embroidery again. "My brother Charles loved needlework. He could not do it. He had no patience for the needle. But he admired it. When I saw the pattern, I thought of him, and I said something careless. That I have not said any more carelessly than most of my careless things, but that I have regretted more than most." He stopped. "That does not excuse it." She looked at the fire screen and thought about Charles Vane, who had been hanged for a letter he had not written, and about Edmund Vane, who had spent 3 years in the cold room of his own certainty that his brother had been guilty, and about what it cost a man to come out of that room. "No," she said, "it does not excuse it." Then she said, "It explains it a little." The room had resumed its ordinary weather, the kind that follows a clearing. Conversation beginning again in small, careful streams. People reassembling themselves in the postures of those who have witnessed something and are deciding how to speak of it. Lady Constance remained in her chair, and Phoebe did not look at her. But from the edge of her vision, she saw the older woman's hands resting in her lap, with the stillness of someone in the act of revising. Miss Farrow had moved toward the door. Edmund said very quietly, "I would like to call on you on Bond Street, with proper notice." She thought about this for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, because she was a woman who had learned that the space before an answer was the last space entirely her own. "You may call," she said. He might have smiled, briefly, narrowly, the most restrained expression of satisfaction she had ever seen on a human face. She thought this might, in fact, be what it looked like when he was moved. She tucked the observation away with the same care she gave to tucked stitches, to the small finalities of craft that hold the whole thing together. He came on a Thursday, with proper notice, at 4 in the afternoon, Mrs. Bra. Roper received him with a manner that suggested she had been mentally preparing for some days. Nell had been instructed to make herself scarce, and had done so with such theatrical effort that she was clearly visible through the kitchen doorway at intervals. The shop was tidy, the light good. Phoebe had put on the dress she wore to Grosvenor Square. He brought her the original design, rolled and tied as it had come to her, released. Now that the hearing had concluded, he laid it on the cutting table. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she took it and carried it to the small fire that burned in the back room grate, and set it in, and they watched it go. It took less time than she would have expected. "Trent," he said, "will require a formal statement from you, presently. There will be a trial, and your testimony will be part of it. I will give it." He was watching her hands, which were still near the grate, the warmth of the fire reaching the backs of her fingers. He reached out, not quite reaching, and his hand stopped a few inches from hers. She was aware of every inch of that distance. The fire crackled. The room held its breath. "Phoebe," he said, her given name in his voice the first time. She felt it as a weight and a warmth together, the specific register of a sound that has been held before it was released. She turned her hand over slightly, an opening rather than a crossing. His fingers settled over hers barely. A contact that was barely contact and entirely certain. They remained like that for a moment, the fire small and steady, the late afternoon light thinning at the window, the sound of the street below carrying on in its ordinary way with no knowledge of what was being settled in the quiet of the back room. He did not stay long that first visit. He was not the kind of man who overstays, which she was beginning to understand as a quality of his discipline rather than of his indifference. He took his leave correctly with the formality of a man who intends to return and is ensuring the return is in good order. At the door, he stopped with his hat in his hand in the doorway. Neither in nor out, which she recognized as the only form of irresolute she had yet seen from him. "The fire screen," he said. "Lady Cavendish will wish to remove it." The association is uncomfortable for her. She may do as she likes with it. I thought, he said carefully, that it might come here instead, if you did not object. She looked at him in the doorway, the autumn street at his back, the last of the November light. Here would suit it well enough, she said. The trial of Sir Gerald occupied 3 days in December, conducted with an efficiency that suggested the evidence had left little to be adjudicated. Mr. Trent appeared as principal witness for the Crown. Phoebe appeared on the second day and gave her statement in a clear, level voice that carried to the back of the gallery, accounting for the commission, the original design, the corrections she had made, the conversation at Upper Brook Street, non and meant, and the night she had sat at her frame with the needle case in both hands and decided she would not sign a document she knew to be false. Edmund sat in the gallery. He did not fidget, and he did not look away, and when she left the stand and came up the aisle toward the door, she passed within a foot of where he sat, and their eyes met in a look that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and meant, between them, exactly what it needed to mean. Lady Constance came to Bond Street in January. She came without announcement and without Miss Farrow, in a carriage that waited at the end of the street in the manner of carriages that belong to people who are not entirely certain of their welcome, Mrs. First. Roper showed her into the back room with an expression that communicated, without words, a comprehensive set of feelings about titled women arriving without notice in establishments they had not previously visited, and then withdrew with equal expressiveness. Lady Constance sat in the chair across from Phoebe's frame and looked at the current work on it, a new commission, a small portrait of a child in silk thread, and said nothing for a long time. She was a woman who used silence, the way some people used furniture, as structure, as placement, as the indication of who was in charge of the arrangement. "My son," she said at last, "has spoken of you." Phoebe threaded a needle. "He has not asked my opinion," Lady Constance said. "He rarely does. Edmund does not ask opinions. He forms them." A pause. "He formed one about you that I believe he formed before he had sufficient information, and he has since spent considerable effort correcting it. That is also characteristic." "I am aware," Phoebe said. Lady Constance looked at the needle case on the table beside the frame. The ivory, the small carved flower, the chamois leather. Her gaze rested there for a moment. "My younger son," she said more quietly, "had a needle case very like that. He kept it on his desk. It served no practical purpose. He was not a man of any practical craft." She stopped. "I was unkind to you in my house." "I was unkind because I was frightened, which is not an excuse, but is an account." She looked at the embroidery work on the frame, the small face taking shape in silk thread, the patience and specificity of it. "Whatever else I thought, I had no right to the words I used." Phoebe set down the needle. "No," she said. "You did not." They regarded each other in the back room of the Bond Street shop, in the cold January light, two women who had been told by different means what their worth was, and were both, in their own ways, in the process of deciding how to answer. Phoebe did not dislike Lady Constance. She was a practical woman who did not require people to be other than they were. She only required them to be honest about it. "Would you take tea?" she said. Lady Constance said, after a moment, "Yes." "I think I would." Edmund came on a Friday in February with the fire screen, which 2 of his footmen carried up the back stairs in the careful manner of men who have been told the object is important to their employer and have decided not to speculate why. They set it in the front room, near the window where the light was good. It looked better there, Phoebe thought, than it had in Grosvenor Square. The light caught the gold thread differently. The foliate pattern was just a pattern now, just the work of her hands, the proportions, correct, the colors, careful. Beside it on the shelf sat the ivory needle case, and beside that, slightly incongruous, the hat Edmund had forgotten on his last visit and not yet retrieved. He stood in the doorway to the back room and looked at the fire screen in its new position. "Trent has a new post," he said. "In Edinburgh, he is pleased. And you," she said. He considered. I have a house in Berkshire that has been shut for 4 years. I had not thought to open it. He looked at the embroidery, at the evidence of her care written in thread. I find I am thinking about opening it. She came to stand beside him. Not the proper distance that the period prescribed, but closer. The distance of a room in which two people have already said what matters and do not require formal approach to structure what is already decided. She could feel the specific warmth of him in the cold February shop, and her own pulse in the way she had come to recognize as the particular register of his presence, the reliable small fact of it. Berkshire is not so far, she said. No, he agreed, it is not. She reached out and picked up the ivory needle case from the shelf beside them. She held it in her palm, the small carved flower under her thumb, the weight of it, familiar and absolute. Outside, February turned slowly toward March. Inside, on the cutting table, a new commission waited. A commission with a design that was her own, derived from nothing, indebted to no one, entirely her own invention. She would begin it on Monday in the good morning light, with the needle case on the table beside her and Edmund's forgotten hat on the shelf. She set the needle case down. "Come inside," she said. "There is tea." He came in. The door closed. The fire screen stood in its corner in the February light, the crooked stitches that were not crooked at all, the treason that had been someone else's entirely, the evidence of her particular and irreducible craft, quiet now. And finally home. If Phoebe's story moved you, leave a thought in the comments below. And thank you sincerely for staying until the end.